In October 1962, the world was watching Cuba. Missiles. Standoffs. The threat of nuclear annihilation. Everyone was looking west. Nobody was looking east. And that is exactly where the world almost ended. There is a war that most history books skip over. A war fought in some of the highest, most brutal terrain on Earth. A war between two nations that together hold nearly half the world's population. A war that unfolded at the exact same moment the Cold War reached its most dangerous peak. Most people have never heard of it. That silence is not an accident. The 1962 Sino-Indian War lasted just 1 month. It ended as suddenly as it began. But in those 32 days, the fate of the entire world hung by a thread thinner than most people will ever realize. This is the story of how two neighboring nations, both freshly born from the shadow of colonialism, stumbled into a conflict that nearly pulled the United States, the Soviet Union, and the entire global order into an abyss no one would have survived. This is the war that almost started World War III. To understand how two nations that once called each other brothers ended up pointing rifles at each other across Himalayan glaciers, you have to go back to the beginning. In 1947, India won its independence from Britain. 2 years later, Mao Zedong's communist forces swept across China, declaring the People's Republic. Two massive, ancient civilizations, newly reborn, now shared one of the longest and most disputed borders on the planet. In the early years, there was hope. Indian Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru believed deeply in Asian solidarity. He championed China's entry onto the world stage. He coined the phrase Hindi Chini Bye Bye. In Hindi, it means, Indians and Chinese are brothers. But borders have a way of testing brotherhood. The core problem was geography and maps. The British had drawn borders that China never fully accepted. Two regions became flashpoints. In the west, the Aksai Chin, a vast, barren plateau at over 17,000 feet, sat on maps claimed by India but increasingly controlled by China. Beijing had quietly built a strategic road through it, connecting Tibet to Xinjiang, without India even knowing for years. In the east, another disputed line, the McMahon Line, separated India's northeastern frontier from Chinese claimed territory. China considered it an illegal colonial imposition. India considered it a sovereign boundary. Both sides claimed they were right. Neither side was willing to move. Through the late 1950s, the tension escalated in small, dangerous increments. Border patrols clashed. Diplomatic protests piled up. China accused India of aggressive forward positioning. India accused China of creeping occupation. Nehru, walking a tightrope between non-alignment and growing alarm, adopted what became known as the forward policy, pushing Indian military posts deeper into contested zones, betting that China would not respond with force. It was a bet he would lose catastrophically. October 20, 1962. Before dawn broke across the Himalayas, the People's Liberation Army launched a coordinated, massive assault along the entire disputed frontier. It was not a skirmish. It was not a patrol clash. It was a full military offensive, precisely planned, overwhelmingly executed. Indian soldiers stationed at high-altitude outposts were caught almost entirely off guard. Many were under-equipped, undersupplied, and holding positions that military commanders in Delhi had barely supported with logistics. The political leadership had believed, genuinely believed, that China would not escalate. They were wrong. The PLA moved with a speed and ferocity that shocked observers around the world. In the eastern sector, Chinese forces tore through Indian defenses in the Northeast Frontier Agency, driving deep into territory that India had considered well within its own border. In the west, they consolidated control of Aksai Chin with brutal efficiency. Indian soldiers fought with extraordinary courage in impossible conditions. Outnumbered, outgunned, freezing, some units holding positions at altitudes where even breathing becomes a struggle. But courage alone could not hold the line. Within days, the situation had become a rout. The speed of China's advance did not just shock Delhi. It sent a shockwave through every major capital on Earth. Here was India, the world's largest democracy, the proud standard-bearer of the non-aligned movement, the nation Nehru had spent 15 years presenting as a moral counterweight in a bipolar world, being dismantled militarily in real time. Nehru, for the first time in his political life, made a decision that would have been unthinkable just months before. He wrote to Washington. He asked for help. The letter was urgent. Some accounts describe it as desperate. India requested American air support, American aircraft, American military hardware. The nation that had built its entire foreign policy identity on refusing to choose sides between Washington and Moscow was now, in the most naked possible terms, asking the United States to intervene. And here is where the story becomes terrifying. Because at the exact moment Nehru was writing that letter, President John F. Kennedy was locked inside the White House, managing the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet nuclear warheads were pointed at American cities. American ships were forming a blockade around Cuba. The world had never been closer to nuclear war. Two existential crises happening simultaneously on opposite sides of the planet. Kennedy could not ignore India. A Chinese military victory of this magnitude would redraw the power map of Asia permanently. It would signal to every nation watching that Beijing's military reach was limitless. It would humiliate the West's most prominent democratic partner in Asia at the worst possible moment. Washington began moving military assets toward the region. American aircraft carriers adjusted their positions in the Indian Ocean. Military advisors flew to Delhi. The United States made it quietly, unmistakably clear that it was prepared to support India. But there was a second superpower watching. Moscow was in a bind unlike any it had faced before. The Soviet Union was China's communist ally, or at least, it had been. By 1962, the Sino-Soviet split was already fracturing that relationship, a deep ideological divorce that Beijing and Moscow were conducting in public with barely concealed contempt. And yet, Soviet credibility in the communist world still demanded some level of solidarity with Beijing. At the same time, Moscow was mid-confrontation with Washington over Cuba. Khrushchev did not need a second front. He did not need the Americans believing that every crisis on Earth was a Soviet-backed conspiracy to expand communist power. So Moscow signaled, cautiously, to Delhi. It tried to position itself as a potential mediator. It attempted to avoid choosing sides. But Soviet weapons were already flowing to India under prior agreements, and nobody quite knew how Beijing would respond to that reality. Four nuclear-armed powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, China, and the implicit specter of a nuclear response if escalation continued, were all now dangerously entangled in a conflict that had started over unmarked mountain ridges. Then came the moment that historians rarely discuss. As Chinese forces advanced toward the plains of Assam, toward territory that was unambiguously, undeniably Indian, Nehru's letter to Kennedy grew more explicit. He was not just asking for weapons anymore. He was asking for American combat aircraft. He was asking for American pilots to fly air missions over Indian territory. American military personnel in direct confrontation with Chinese forces. If that had happened, if a single American aircraft had engaged a Chinese unit, the entire logic of Cold War escalation would have kicked in. China would have faced an impossible choice. Back down and lose face catastrophically, or respond and risk drawing the Soviets in on one side, the Americans more fully on another, and transforming a border war in the Himalayas into the opening chapter of something no one had a name for yet. The world was perhaps 72 hours away from finding out which choice Beijing would make. And then, without warning, it stopped. On November 21, 1962, 32 days after it had begun, the People's Republic of China announced a unilateral ceasefire. Chinese forces would halt. Chinese forces would, in many areas, withdraw back to positions they had held before the conflict began. The announcement stunned everyone. To this day, the full reasoning behind Beijing's decision remains a matter of historical debate. Some analysts believe China had achieved its core strategic objective. It had shattered the myth of Indian military power, demonstrated its own dominance of the Himalayan frontier, and sent an unmistakable message to every watching nation about the consequences of challenging Beijing's territorial claims. Others argue that China recognized the trap it was walking into. American involvement was no longer a diplomatic abstraction. Soviet neutrality was shaky. Supply lines across the Himalayas in winter were becoming untenable. A prolonged war risked exactly the kind of superpower entanglement that could spiral beyond anyone's control. Perhaps it was both. Perhaps China's leadership looked at the board, saw that they had won everything they needed to win, and decided that the next move led somewhere no one wanted to go. The guns fell silent. But the silence came at a price. India's military humiliation was profound and lasting. Nehru, the architect of non-alignment, the dreamer of Asian brotherhood, died less than 2 years later. Many who knew him believed his spirit broke somewhere in those Himalayan valleys. India launched one of the most ambitious military modernizations in its history, a program that continues to shape South Asian geopolitics to this day. The war permanently poisoned relations between the world's two most populous nations, a wound that has never fully healed, visible in every border standoff, every diplomatic chill, every strategic rivalry that continues into the present century. The conflict also accelerated India's covert nuclear weapons program. The lesson Delhi took from 1962 was clear and cold. In a world of nuclear powers, a nation without nuclear weapons was a nation without a final guarantee of sovereignty. India would test its first nuclear device 12 years later. And in the broader theater of the Cold War, 1962 cemented the Sino-Soviet split, pushed India into a deeper, if always complicated, relationship with both Washington and Moscow, and demonstrated that the most dangerous moments in history are not always the ones the world is watching. We remember October 1962 for Cuba, for Kennedy and Khrushchev, for missiles and blockades, and the 13 days that taught the world what nuclear brinkmanship actually felt like. We should also remember the Himalayas. We should remember that while the cameras pointed at the Caribbean, an entire second catastrophe was unfolding in the mountains, one that came within reach of pulling every major power into the same unthinkable fire, through a different door, in a different part of the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis ended because two men chose to step back from the edge. The Sino-Indian War ended because one nation decided it had won enough. In both cases, the world was lucky. The question worth sitting with, the question that makes this history more than a footnote, is a simple one. How many times can the world be lucky before its luck finally runs out? The war lasted 32 days. The wound has lasted 60 years. And the border, to this day, remains disputed.